Taoiseach, 6 months ago, on the 5th of April of this year, in a leader's question to the then Taoiseach Deputy Enda Kenny on the tracker mortgage fraud, I told the Taoiseach what has been appearing in the media over the last number of weeks. Did I have a whistleblower in the banks? No. I just had a healthy suspicion of senior bankers, backed up by the experience of 30 years of banking scandals and rip-offs. Scandals like the dirt scandal, the Ansbacher accounts, the bogus non-resident accounts, and of course the destruction of this country by the banks during the boom-bust period. I knew, like every other Irish citizen knew and knows, that the banks and senior bankers have no moral compass. Taoiseach, the tracker mortgage fraud is a huge scandal which requires criminal investigation. I asked the then Taoiseach to make a formal complaint to the Gardaí and to call the fraud squad in to investigate the banks. I told him that any delay in ordering a Garda investigation could lead to destruction and/or alteration of relevant records with a view to blaming subordinates and junior staff. He refused to call in the Gardaí in an effort, I am sure, to protect the banks and senior bankers. 6 months later, however, we see the extent of the massive fraud, affecting 20,000 or more mortgage holders, 15 banks and €1 billion. It is now abundantly clear, Taoiseach, that this scandal involves collusion by the banks in a systemic and widespread fraud. It is, of course, a scandal in itself that the Gardaí have still not been sent into the banks and that no formal complaint has been made to the Gardaí. Taoiseach, I want to ask you, do you accept that if Taoiseach Enda Kenny had agreed to my demand 6 months ago to send in the fraud squad to the banks, that much fraud could have been avoided and that much trauma, pain and even deaths and self-harm could have been prevented? Will you now, as Taoiseach today, at long last, send in the Garda fraud squad so that senior bankers can be held to account? And do you accept, Taoiseach, that until senior bankers are made subject to the normal criminal fraud law, that victims of this kind of bank crime will happen again and again and again into the future?
Healy, Taoiseach. Thank you. I think it's important to say, first of all, that the Central Bank has engaged the Gardaí on this matter. And as they've done so, I think it's probably inappropriate for me to say too much about that, except to say that we are a democracy. It's not the case that the former Taoiseach or the Minister for Justice can send in the Gardaí or send in the fraud squad. The way it works is that somebody makes a complaint to the Gardaí consider the complaint and decide whether or not they need to carry out an investigation or carry out a raid as necessary. I don't know whether Deputy Healy made a complaint himself at that time, but of course it would have been open to him to do so. I think when it comes to this issue, we have to remember that the people who should be at the front of our minds are the 20,000 individuals and families who have been affected by the scandal. We talk about 20,000 accounts. Behind that are probably 40,000 people. If you consider the average size of a household, almost 1% of our population has been affected by this. And they've been subjected to unnecessary stress. They've been subjected to financial hardship and in some cases even lost their homes or investment properties. Where, as we said last week, we believe the actions of the banks by incorrectly removing people from tracker mortgages was a serious breach of trust. We also believe that some of the banks have been dragging their feet in solving this problem at a real human cost. What we're in the middle of now is quite a complex process, but customers affected should have their trackers' mortgages restored and be fully compensated as a matter of priority. The Minister of Finance has met with the CEOs of the main banks, Bank of Ireland, AIB, Ulster Bank, PTSB and KBC, and he sought from them three things. First, a detailed explanation from each of the banks as to the status of their tracker redress programme. Secondly, an explanation as to why this process has been so unbelievably slow. And thirdly, their plans for resolving it quickly. While the Central Bank is a fully independent body as regulator, the Minister has also contacted the Central Bank to ensure that it has sufficient powers and sufficient resources to ensure that the banks resolve the problem. We want to make it clear once again that the Government will take further actions in the weeks and months ahead if we don't see further progress on this matter, and further progress quickly, and that is the restoration of those 200,000 people and their families to the correct interest rate, full compensation and redress.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Healy.
Ceann Comhairle, the Taoiseach says that the Central Bank have been in contact with the Gardaí, but actually, as the Taoiseach well knows, no formal complaint has been made, neither by the Central Bank or indeed by the Taoiseach himself, who is quite open to make a complaint. And indeed, the banks, Ceann Comhairle, have a 30-year history of scandal after scandal. They've been rewarded for that scandal, and the public was forced to bail them out to the tune of €64 billion. And the public and the citizens have suffered desperate austerity and deprivation as a result. And of course, variable rate mortgage holders today are paying twice the EUP average rate and being ripped off. And unfortunately, successive governments have protected the bankers. We now believe that Minister O'Donoghue has been sent in to discuss and admonish the banks, whatever that means. At best, I think, a slap on the wrist. There's also talk of a fine. Of course, the Taoiseach well knows that any fine on the banks will be paid by the bank's customers. So, Taoiseach, why is the Government deliberately avoiding sending in the Gardaí and making a formal complaint to the Gardaí in relation to this matter, which is open to you as an individual and open to you as a government to do? And isn't it clear now that banks and bankers can only be brought to their senses by criminal investigation? And I ask you again, Taoiseach, send in the Guard of Forensic Accountants and send in the fraud squad, and do it now.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach, to conclude, please.
As I said, the Central Bank has engaged the Garda Síochána on this matter. It is not within the authority of the Government to order in the fraud squad. That is not how it works. I do not, as a matter of fact, I do not know whether or not a formal complaint has been made as yet. It is, of course, open to any individual, any citizen in the state who believes that a crime has been committed and has evidence to back that up, to make a formal complaint to the Gardaí. And if the Deputy believes a crime has been committed and has evidence to back it up, he should make a complaint now, or if he hasn't already, he should have made it many months ago.
Taoiseach, that concludes Leaders' questions. We move now to questions.